Was coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Rev Don. And every day I like to spend this time with you and get to talk to you directly. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Rev Don, as many people already are doing, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you're watching on. They'll show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I want to say hello to Samantha in the chat room and to Ravenwolf on the chat room. It's good to see you both. And hello to Sir Eric in the chat room. It's good to see you. And it's good to see everyone. This is one of my favorite parts of this broadcast. Today, I was going to talk about, hello to Katrina in the chat room. I was going to talk about Correllianism in the 1990s, which we are going to talk about. But yesterday in my Facebook feed, I was reminded of a particular meme that I did about 9 years ago. And if you followed the latest link to this broadcast, you saw that meme as our placeholder. And hello to Barbara in the chat room, and to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you. And this is a very interesting story, so I wanted to take a little time today and make our discussion of Correllianism in the 1990s go for several days. But I wanted to talk about that meme a little bit here at our beginning, and that would be, again, 9 years ago. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. When this meme first came up, it was a very nasty anti-Wiccan meme. I'm not certain if it was actually serious or a parody, but people were taking it very seriously. And it certainly appeared to be serious. And one of the problems that was happening is a lot of the people who were pictured in the meme were not connected in any way to the people who made it. And they were quite upset. There was one woman in particular whose photos from her hand fasting were used in this meme. And she was very upset to have this very special day made into this very negative thing. So I tried to contact the people who had done this and get them to remove it, but they would not listen to that. And so what I ended up doing instead was creating a positive version of the same meme. And hello to Christine in the chat room. So if you look at the version that I did, it is, are your children interested in witchcraft? And then it talks about numerous positive things that we do that might be a sign that your children were interested in witchcraft. And it included things like, let me see if I can find it here. But it included a number of positive things that we would want to say about ourselves. And therefore, that made this negative meme into a positive meme. It included, for example, praying for peace, honoring nature, taking part in healing ceremonies, loving animals, hope for the future, believing in racial and gender equality, not wanting to hurt anyone, building a better world, and having no patience with bigots. Those are the things that I put on, and I couldn't tell you now what was on the original negative meme. It was 9 years ago, and after the positive one came out, the negative one did end up going away. I don't know if it was because it no longer was able to accomplish its purpose, or what the reason was, but you never see it after that, really. But the positive one has gone on to actually make the rounds many, many times on Facebook, and I'm very proud of that. And hello to Lynn in the chat room. Hello to Mary in the chat room. And, I think that one of the best things that we can do in life is take something negative and make something positive from it. Now, people have often asked me about this and similar stories, why I didn't just tell them they could not use my photo. Well, firstly, that doesn't necessarily work. But secondly, I don't own the copyright to that photo. I can't tell them to do that. They might even have had a legal right to use it. I don't know. Because it was done as clip art. And so people under a lot of different versions can use it. A lot of people, I don't think, ever pay for it as clip art and use it. But I've seen it in places like, or photos from that same day have shown up in National Geographic magazine, a variety of news stories, often having nothing to do with Wicca, but with wider witchcraft. I've shown up as the face of African black magic, moody magic that uses body parts. Lots of very strange places have shown up, and there's nothing really I can do about that. It just is part of having been willing to do a piece of clip art. But it is available as a copyright-free photo. So I couldn't do that, even though I don't think they showed no sign of actually having the right to have used it in that sense. And the other people involved had not done their pieces in that same way, and they had not been able to get it taken down either. So instead, I made something positive. And that positive thing is still going long after the negative things have ceased. And so I wanted to start by talking about that. And I always find it a little bit of a I guess I'd say a little bit of a kick to see this thing making another round, because nobody seems to realize it came in its positive form from me. But it's always nice to see it. And it is one of those things that you do in life and you don't really think it's going to be anything major, and you see it later. Another thing I did like that was the Other People anti-tract with Oberon Zell and Pete Pathfinder Davis, that I sometimes find still making its way around. And Sir Eric says, I just Googled the phrase, is your child being lured into witchcraft? And the only thing that came up was this meme. And that's very, very interesting. It does show that sometimes the best way to answer something is by doing something positive. And with the Other People, people often don't know that I was the artist on that anti-tract. And they'll mention it to me, and I always find it very interesting when that happens. And that was part of Correllianism in the 90s in Chicago. But let us talk a little bit about Correllianism in the 90s. As we came to the late 80s, Lady Crystal and I were working at the J&M Psychic Fairs, which is where I met Sir Edward. And in the 90s, we really started working together. We started originally with Psychic Services Incorporated, which was intended to get more business for the different psychics who were part of it, and also with the Church of Gaia. The Church of Gaia was created by a union between the Society of Avalon and the Correllian tradition. And Mary says, I wondered where you met Ed. It was very interesting. We believe it was Eleanor Weiss who arranged for us to actually meet in that circumstance. Eleanor Weiss was called the Rolls Royce of psychics. And she was a spiritualist minister then in her 80s. And the thing that happened is that Edward and I lived very near to each other, and very far from the fairs, which were in the suburbs of Chicago. And being a native Chicagoan, Edward did not have a car. I did. And so I started to give him rides there, and we got to know each other very well initially during those rides. Um, the um, the Church of Gaia was originally an experiment dealing with Gaia's theology, and was not really either part of the Newcastle Society, which I had called the Society of Avalon. It was the Newcastle Society. Nor was it really part of the Correllian Church exactly at that time. It became part of the Correllian Church over time, and it became Holy City Temple over time. But it began as an experiment. Hello to Baron in the chat room. And we worked with a lot of different things in that temple, including a lot of psychic reading, a lot of time magic. Hello to Sir Brian in the chat room. And it was a very interesting time. We also were working with the Psychic Chicago magazine and Psychic Chicago radio. I was the art editor for Psychic Chicago magazine and occasional guest on Psychic Chicago radio. Psychic Chicago magazine, one of the things that has lived longest from it was the Team Adventures, which were like a little graphic novel that we did at that time that focused mostly on actual real people in the Chicago pagan and psychic community in a caricatured sort of way. And it became a very good draw for the magazine because people wanted to see if they were in the Team and how they were portrayed. It was a very interesting experience. I've often said you learn a lot about people by how they react to a humorous portrayal of themselves. Not an insulting portrayal, but a humorous portrayal. And I did try to make all of the portrayals humorous without being insulting. And it was very interesting to see different people's reactions. Some of the people who I thought would be very upset were not upset at all. Others who I thought would not be upset were. It all had to do, I think, with their own shadow work, their own way of seeing themselves. The most famous scene in the Team was at the community event Heathen Happenings, where all of they're looking for the villain in the piece, and they know that person is present in the room. And so I filled the room with all kinds of different people who came out of that psychic and pagan community. And it was very interesting to see who thought they were who in that room. Some people who were actually intended to be in it never caught themselves. Others were certain they were in it and even bragged about it quite largely without ever actually having been intended to be in the scene. So that was a very interesting thing. The most interesting thing about the Team was when I finally did create an artificial character who did not exist in real life, and then they showed up at the next big event I went to, as if I had drawn them into existence. That was a very interesting thing. The biggest thing that happened to us early in the 90s, and there's a lot to discuss as we go through the 90s, more than we're going to get to today. Two really big things. There were a couple of readings that ran up until this year and turned out to be accurate for that whole time. And one in particular I've often talked about was by Rosemary Fletcher, who talked about Sir Edward doing a worldwide magazine distributed every day, something which at the time she did the reading most people would not have thought it was anything but a brick and mortar magazine. The internet was not really a thing yet. It did turn out that it was through the internet, but she had no way to see that. The other thing, of course, was the Parliament of the World's Religions. And we were talking about the Parliament of the World's Religions last week quite extensively. But I first heard about the Parliament from Sir Edward in 1991, I believe. And he was very enthused. He was working as a volunteer in the offices of the Parliament. He very much believed in their mission, which was bringing people from different religions together to talk and try to work out their problems. And he was, again, very committed to this message. And he tried to tell other people in the Chicago community at that time. Nobody was actually willing to listen. They were all of the opinion that this sort of thing could never actually happen. As a result of which, for the most part, they were quite unprepared for it when it actually did happen. Most of them found out about it through the news a few weeks before it happened, and then of course they became very much also in support of it. During that first Parliament, he was giving me daily updates about what was happening. I was not able to go. And afterwards, a couple of interesting things happened that I don't know that the stories have necessarily been told. Now, the story of Your Voice has been told a couple of times. I don't know if anyone has mentioned the Chicago Pagan Host Committee. This was put together shortly after the Parliament. It involved a number of Chicago pagan leaders, myself included, Dina Buddha from the Fellowship of Isis, Stanley Mosrick from the Midwest Pagan Council. But apparently, it did not have what you would call full-throated backing. It was around this same time that Your Voice was published as a collection. And through one thing and another, both of these led to a meeting in which it was pointed out that pagans were only at the Parliament because the Parliament was bending over backwards to have them there, and that their being there was a privilege, and that they really were not on an equal basis with anyone else. And if you watched Journey to the Parliament, you'll see Edward tell this story much better than I do. But for him in particular, it as he said, it branded him for the rest of his life. It was the motivation behind a lot of later things that he did to find the right to be there, which was defined in part by numbers. And the numbers that were given were 100,000, which was what the UN used to determine if something was actually a religion or not. And the Pagan Host Committee did not survive. I think it had one meeting. And Mary says, you and Sir Ed have known each other for quite a while. I love hearing stories of the two of your adventures. Well, there have been some adventures. That's certainly true. Another thing that followed the Parliament was the Pagan Leadership Conference in Chicago. And this was done by the Pagan Interfaith Embassy. It was put together by Sir Edward. He was the host. And what it did is it brought together the leadership of most of the groups in Chicago to talk about the community. And it got very much the same reaction that the Parliament got, that this is not a possibility, that they could not come together without ending up in a fight, that they could not have a positive interaction. And Edward's way of handling this was to make sure that they understood this meeting was about them. It was never about him. It was not about the Pagan Interfaith Embassy. was about the Chicago community. And so what he did first was that he offered a brief introduction, and then he started to introduce the different leaders of the community. And each one of them got a certain amount of time to talk about their groups, their experiences, etc. And that really started this event off in a very positive way. Many of them later said they only came because they thought they were going to see a train wreck. And instead, they saw something beautiful. And then it went on through a number of workshops. We've published the photos a number of times. Hello to Melanie in the chat room. Melanie says it would be great to do pagan leadership conferences again. Well, they certainly were an experience. They did, in the end, end up in a fight, but that was years later, and after several positive occurrences had happened. The mistake they ultimately made was trying to become, instead of an event, an organization. As an event, they were very successful. And that first one, there were all kinds of different events, some of them dealing with local businesses, some dealing with working with the media, a variety of different things. And all kinds of interesting people came. We had there was Guy Spiro from the Monthly Aspectarian. There was Dina Buddha from the Fellowship of Isis. There was Ted Chapman who had just retired, I believe, from the Lion Triad, and or just did retire after. There was Benita Chapman from the Covenant of the Goddess. There was Jim Bebekas from Adhet Per. There was Vince Hawkins from the Circle of Danu. There was all kinds of different people. There were some local store owners like Stephanie Bardo from Arcanum Books. It was just a wonderful chance for these people to get to see each other in a no-pressure type of situation. And one of the things that came out of that, in addition to future things with the Pagan Leadership Conference, was a number of other low pagan or low pressure pagan situations. There's a pagan social night that lasted for several years. There was ritual at the lakefront of Lake Michigan that lasted for many years. And it was a time with a lot of things happening. Shortly after the Pagan Leadership Conference, we started to do the Round Table magazine. Edward was the publisher, I was the editor for that, and it ran for about 10 years. And this was put together as a community magazine for that Chicago community. And not entirely surprisingly, it started with an attempt to kill it and exert power over it from outside groups, which failed. And again, it went on for many years. It brought back the Psi team for future adventures. The thing that it offered that I think was most interesting was a news section in every issue. It involved national news, but also local news. If you ever want to know what the Chicago pagan community was like in the 1990s, it's there in the roundtables. We would go to many different pagan events and report on them. And these were not only the big events like the Pagan Leadership Conference, the Chicago Icean Convention, the International Thoreau Conference when that happened, but also the local happenings of individual temples. And the roundtable included a listing of public temples. At one point, there were 30 different temples and or organizations listed under that. And that's what having this kind of public presence can do for you. It really made a great renaissance in the community. And of course, other magazines followed. Um, we talked about some of those low pressure events I was talking about a moment ago, like the Pagan Social Night. It was a very interesting magazine. Some of the interesting stories we covered in it included Hal Story, the man with three hearts. Hal Story was the president of Panthea Temple there in Chicago, and he had a situation where he became, at that time at least, the person who had spent the longest period of time on the artificial heart that had been developed. He was in need of a heart transplant, and he was there, I think, for 30 some days, waiting for that heart transplant on this artificial heart. And he talked about, for example, how he had used the rhythm of the machine for meditation while he was there. And that was one of the more interesting stories. And the round table was one of the more interesting things. Around 1997, Holy City Temple founded as such, coming out of the Church of Gaia. And one of the first things we started doing was creating lessons, which would become our standardized Correllian lessons. And it was, they were usually written shortly before the class would begin. They were, but that became a very productive period of time for Holy City Temple. We found ourselves doing 65 rituals a year as a general rule, which was a wonderful ritual training for everyone involved. And it was a time with a great deal of movement forward. And these were all things that certainly would come in helpful at a later point in time. And we worked with many other things that we'll talk about tomorrow. But I see that we are near the end of our half hour. So I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for your continued support of me. I do have some pieces of artwork on my page if anyone is interested that I'm offering for sale. I also am available for readings if anyone is interested in one. And I want to thank you for joining me today and every day here on Midday with Rev Don. Tomorrow we're going to continue talking about Correllianism in the 90s, and we'll talk maybe a little bit at greater length about some things. So thank you all for being here. I love all of you. I love talking with you. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we come to you now with thanks and love for all that you do for us. And we ask you, what, if anything, we can do to make a better world that we live in. Help us to see ourselves more clearly. Help us to see our world more clearly. And help us to meet the needs we see there. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we know you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.